10 cents to every dollar that white people have. So it is not, the primary thing is not just the difference in the rate of exploitation of Africans in the United States and in Africa, but the rate of exploitation that exists between African people and European of the oppressor nations in general. I think that's a unifying thing. And so no, I don't see that as profound contradiction. I don't know, I think if there may be another specific kinds of question that you want to raise. My experience is that when I go to Africa, wherever I am in Africa, what I find is that Africans everywhere, whether it's there or any other place, except my definition of being an African and all of us being an African people, because there is a false national consciousness that we can find among Africans, like Africans here seen too many Tarzan movies and have certain assumptions about the reality of Africans and whether or not it's good to even be an African. I go on the continent of Africa. I spoke to a class of students in South Africa, and when I finished, one of the youngsters stood up and said, "Thank you for making us proud to be African," And Garvey, so I don't think it is a contradiction that impedes struggle. The contradiction that we will have is the African petty bourgeoisie in Africa and in the United States have a stake in preventing the unification of African people worldwide. I think that becomes the greater contradiction, more than the relative difference in exploitation that exists between African people, in different places. Yeah.
Thank you. Uhuru.
Did I respond to you? I'm not. Yeah. Okay. All right. Uhuru.
Okay. Well, I have this question about Russia and stuff, but first I just wanted to say that in one of our meetings online or on the phone or something, Sandy was saying that some North American group you were working with had some problem because they were like, "Oh, we're not being treated like equals" or something. And I just want to say, like, that is like so outrageous, because here, like, we've been oppressing you for 400 years, and your response is to turn around and free us and like let us participate and spend all the time educating us and like believing in us that we can be revolutionaries. So
yeah.
And just like the whole just like everyone in the party, like, is so cordial, so humane, so kind. I don't know. That's my experience. I don't know what they're talking about. Like, what the hell are they?
Yeah.
What are they talking about?
Yeah.
I don't understand. I think it's like that, they're used to being above. So then when you assert equality to them, that's like they've come down or something, So I don't know. Anyway.
That's an aspect of it. But another aspect of it, what they mean is that they don't have an equal right to define the struggle of African people. Like, they come into a meeting, we're talking about the liberation of African people. They feel like they ought to have as much right as we do to say, how to move and what the issue is. And if they come into a movement based on the liberation of African people, that they are not being treated equally because they don't have equal right to define what it is that we're about. That's the biggest struggle they have on. Yeah.
Well, anyway, I just want to thank you, for like, still believing in North Americans, Europeans, giving us another chance,
Uhuru, come
live
right.
up to it. Uhuru. So my question was, okay, so I have this problem that comes up when I'm talking with people about politics, and sometimes they kind of like fixate on the word socialism in the name African People's Socialist Party.
Right.
So then they bring up, first they bring up two things they bring up that I have like little trouble with or whatever. So they bring up the collapse of socialism in Russia, and I always say that that happened because like they didn't really hit the main contradiction of like modern world history, which is colonialism. So therefore it was kind of like doomed to failure, because it was like, what are they really doing, So is that correct? And could you help me like elaborate on that? And then the second thing, another thing that happens is I get confused when people bring up the word National Socialism of Germany, the Nazis, they use that word too, and I kind of flounder on that one. I don't know what to say to them. So can you help me with both of those?
Yeah, the issue of not only Russia and what came to be the Soviet Union, but also China, is that they work from, like a basic Marxian explanation of what it would take to win socialism. And that had to do with the ascendancy of the working class to power. But that did not fully take into account what we've been talking about, that capitalism is a world economy. It's not just an economy that existed in China or existed in Russia. And in fact, Lenin, made prediction on a weekly basis that the revolution is going to be happening in Germany, that the rest of the workers of, et cetera, are going to be coming to join us, because he understood that the success of the so-called Russian Revolution was dependent in the final analysis on socialist revolution happening in all of Europe. And eventually he began to talk more and more about the oppressed workers of the world. But the thing is that the Marxists had talked about the historical basis for the rise of socialism, and that had to do with the development of capitalism till it became rotten ripe, as Lenin used to define imperialism as being, and the contradictions so overwhelmed the contradiction so overwhelmed that whole productive process, that whole social system, that revolution would give rise to socialism, that there was a historical basis for that. And those were the contradictions were inherent to capitalism itself. So what we're saying is that they missed the point. They missed the boat, because we quote in many different places what Marx talks about, how capitalism really required as a pedestal slavery, pure and simple, in the New World. Now that was the foundation. That was the thing that capitalism rested on. And so what we saw in Russia and China were not the historical basis for the rise of socialism, but what we saw was the political conditions for socialists to seize power, which is different. Socialists seized power in Russia, socialists seized power in China, but they seized power still. They lived in an ocean of capitalist economy and reaction. And so the international bourgeoisie was able to isolate the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union did not have the advantage of a world economy that brought in cheap rubber, cheap labor from Africa and all the other colonies, although they were able to do some relatively important things in the short run, because they overthrew a semi-feudal country where people could not go to certain levels of education because they were not tied to the nobility, where the peasants did not have any land and what they needed, and they could not expect any kind of progress, where there were not hospitals for the people and things like that, and any kind of housing. So in a relatively short period of time, they were able to transform this semi-feudal entity into something that were feeding more people, housing more people, allowed people to become doctors, and people had to go to clinics and things like that. But it ran into its limitations. But it still projected itself as this socialism that was going to be the panacea for all the workers. And so it lied to the world, it lied to itself, it covered up contradictions inside Russia, and so that was what we were looking at. And so we finally saw that this entity that existed in a capitalist world economy could no longer hold on, and it kind of imploded. But what was really interesting about that for me is that when you look at what happened in Russia and Eastern Europe, what you're looking at is what would happen in the whole European world if they were denied the resources that was coming from the colonial countries. You see? So that was why it went down. So it was because the historical basis for the advent of socialism currently emerging for everybody to see. And that's why all the imperialists everywhere are so frantic. And that is the pedestal upon which capitalism rests is now rocking. It's a rocky damn pedestal. That's why, smart bombs and IEDs and things like that become a part of the lingua franca. Should I say that? Because so that's the challenge. So that's why the so-called Russian thing didn't happen, because again, it was socialists who took power, in the Soviet Union, but not because the conditions were there, and socialists could take power, but there was not the conditions for the advent of socialism. Did not exist there. So I don't know if that's helpful or not.
What about the Germany thing?
The Germany?
National Socialism. Why did they? I don't understand that.
Because they were socialists. They were socialists. They were for redistribution and doing things. I mean, Germany under Hitler, healthcare. Even Volkswagen, the people's this and that. They created all this stuff. And the German people loved it, as quiet as it's kept. They loved it, and then began to hate it until the occupation. After the loss. So, and they were the national, what were they? The National Socialist, what Nazi? What was it? Some kind of National Socialist Party. They call themselves National Socialists. National Socialists, right, who hated Marxists, but they were National Socialists. And so people talk about National Socialists. They talk about Nazis and forces who are like Nazis, but Nazis are relatively recent, kind of phenomenon. The question of socialism is something that people have been struggling around for a long time, and they characterize themselves as National Socialists, and what they did is National Socialism as opposed to internationalism, etc. And although many people call themselves internationalists and socialists, etc., they act just like National Socialists, and the consequences of, if they were successful, they would simply have another National Socialist. If the Marxists in this country would seize power with the notions that somehow the Africans and Puerto Ricans and all these other damn people didn't have the right to struggle as people, but somehow once the workers took power, we might have the right to succeed or something like that. I mean, what in the hell is that? You know what I mean? And anyway, yeah. So that's where that discussion, I know that's not a thorough, go ahead.
I have another question. Can I ask one more question? Really?
Go ahead.
No,
Okay.
Thanks. It's been a fantastic presentation. I really feel like I'm walking away just more prepared to take on a lot of these issues. Going back to the question, I guess, what Stephanie talked about, the withering away of the state, and you drew that comparison between the withering away of the state and the withering away of the European bourgeois nation as the more relevant sort of distinction. At least, correct me if I'm wrong, but that seemed to be where you're going with that. And then what you said was that in order to wither away the European nation, we'd have to build an African nation. That's the goal, is to build a sort of competing. I think this is where I'm looking for the clarification on. If you could just talk some more about that, just in terms of where that, in order to have that world without borders, without those nations, a redefining of nations has to occur first that builds more nations.
The European nation was born of a process that fractured the national unity, or the potential for national unity among African and other oppressed peoples around the world. That's how it came into being. People were separated, false borders were made, etc. False national consciousness even given, created whole new peoples, at least in theory, emerged as a consequence of that. That's the foundation. That's the European nation came about as a consequence of that. And it not just because they wanted people to live in different neighborhoods, but because it facilitated exploitation. And they had to create oppressive apparatuses to maintain this exploitation. The European nation itself was born as a bourgeois nation. It was born as a capitalist nation. So that came together. So when we talk about the struggles for national liberation of African and other peoples, we're talking about a struggle for it to be legitimate and meaningful, and for it to ultimately succeed. It's going to be a struggle against imperialism, against capitalism, and therefore we're talking about the emergence of a proletarian, African proletarian nation, a working class nation that is the exact, is it antipode to the bourgeois nation, and is a part of deconstructing. It has become a part of the deconstruction of the bourgeois nation or the European nation. And since the bourgeois state came wrapped in the skin of you know, like a racialized, you know, nation process, it also contributes to the process of the withering away of the